Hello, I'm Patricia Gras. Welcome to Passion Time here from Rice University campus, but with a professor from Duke University. Her name is Diane Wilson. She's a cultural anthropologist. She's written many books on Guatemala. Today we're going to talk about one in particular called Who Counts? The Mathematics of Death and Life After Genocide. But before we start, you started working in Guatemala in 1985 from what I read. And I want to know how you found your passion, because you really are passionate about that country.
I think like a lot of people's passion, it was serendipitous. I was taking classes in undergraduate with a professor who was profoundly engaged with Guatemala.
Okay.
She's herself Chilean, but had also become enganchado,
enamored,
like they say, like hooked.
Yeah. Hooked.
And she hooked me. She was planning to do a project about the refugees who had been fleeing Guatemala into southern Mexico, into Chiapas.
About 150,000, right, is what I read? Yeah.
At least, maybe up to 500,000 were displaced into Mexico. That's exactly what she wanted to find out.
Okay.
But she had received a death threat from the United States ambassador in Guatemala, and so she asked me
if you minded death threats,
if I wouldn't mind going, and with another one of her students.
What a great friend!
But it was
life-changing,
an amazing experience. And so with another young woman, it was still military government, right in the middle of the Civil
1985,
War.
in the middle of the war, yeah.
We went down 22 years old, looking like, I think, stupid hippies, and we went to a lot of places where really terrible things had happened. And the passion, I think everybody's passion is probably both about love and something else that's more complicated. And with Guatemala, because it was the United States' fault, what was happening there. The 1954 coup, backing the military governments, I couldn't ever turn away from that.
And the coup was of a democratically elected government, which happens a lot in the 50s because of the Cold War. Explain to me, I mean, let's give it a little bit of context, because before we talk about the book, let's talk about the Civil War. It was a 36-year-old war. And what did you find? Because you're sort of an expert on the genocide in Guatemala.
Yeah. You're right. It was a very complicated situation on the one hand, and on the other hand, relatively simple. It was about land, the basic needs. So many people in Guatemala, even to this day, are subsistence farmers, campesinos, peasants, many of them indigenous. There are 22 Mayan indigenous groups in Guatemala, which is a small country. So a combination of people's exclusion and being unable to feed their children and their sort of relations to this pretty racist structure.
Right.
And then when the coup put in military governments that were backing the oligarchs, who were basically running an export-related economy, who needed cheap labor to pick coffee and cut sugar cane and pick bananas. You had this situation where people pretty much decided in the early 1960s, along with a lot of other people in the world. You think about decolonialization in Africa, 59, the Cuban Revolution, all these other things. People saying, I'd rather die on my feet than die on my knees.
Right.
And so people picked up arms. There was a counterinsurgency, also backed by the United States. And there were sort of different moments in the war. We can go into a lot more detail about that. But in the late 1970s and early 1980s, again, Vietnam, Iran, we think about all these places in the world where people had won, right? Whatever that ended up being. And in Guatemala, there was a very powerful both social movement, an unarmed social movement, and an increasingly strong armed movement. Remember 1979, the Sandinistas take power. The FMLN in El Salvador looks very strong. In Guatemala, I think there was these dreams that this whole other kind of world could made.
Exist.
And unlike in Nicaragua and unlike in El Salvador, I think, and this is backed up by the United Nations Commission on Historical Clarification, they said the racism is what allowed the army to just move into the highlands when they thought the revolution was going to win, and just take out entire communities. Like every single person they could find, they murdered.
They destroyed how many villages? 634
There were
villages?
626 massacres, which means killing over 4 people at a time. There were close to 400 villages that were wiped out.
Wiped out completely.
And in
men, women, children, everybody.
Livestock, corn. So one of the really amazing things that happened is that the very people who have suffered this have continued to struggle for justice. And you probably know that in 2013 they brought General Rios Montt to trial.
And then he was let go again. And
it was
now he's back
overturned
in
on a technicality.
Yeah, right.
They didn't question. They couldn't actually question the findings. But one of the basic reasons that they found it was genocide was not just the mass murder, and that includes of pregnant women, of tiny babies, of children, but also that they destroyed the people's ability to maintain life. They killed all their animals. They destroyed the corn stalks. Everything that sort of keeps people alive was destroyed, and that was how they were able to prove under international law the intent to destroy, in whole or in part.
So, going back to Rios Montt, some military were tried and they're now serving time. Some, very few, right? But
and
what happened?
Enormous effort.
Yeah, enormous effort on the part of many social justice advocates and survivors. But something happened very recently in Guatemala that got everybody excited, which was that
the president
was put in prison for corruption.
Yeah.
It apparently had something to do with the United Nations, and so tell me about that, because that has given hope to a lot of Latin Americans who are tired of the corruption in the government.
Yeah.
And it happened in Guatemala. I mean, this has not happened anywhere else in Latin America.
And in Guatemala, where, after genocide, so much of what seems to have happened was that people were just struggling simply to survive. No, they were just struggling simply to survive. And whenever I've talked to people about different kinds of even social justice movements, or even like really, really basic, small scale sort of politics, everyone says we remember the war. Everyone's afraid the war is going to come back. When people are trying to stop, for example, gold mining, mountaintop removal gold mining, or a big hydroelectric dam that's going to flood people's farmland, they seem so afraid to resist because we remember the war. People are so afraid it's going to come back, and yet people still do. So when you say in Guatemala, of all places, this happened, it is incredible.
It is incredible.
And part of it is this ant-like work of working on all these different fronts that people have been doing since even before the war ended in 1996. And one of those fronts was trying to create a special organization. It went through many stages, but now it's called CICIG, which is the, I'm going to get it wrong. It's against corruption and impunity in Guatemala.
That was the
Special
word.
Commission.
Yes.
And it is unlike anything that exists in the world. This is the first time this has ever been tried and done. And what it basically does is keep sovereignty in the Guatemalan justice system, but it backs it up with both UN-trained people doing police work, forensic work, but only through the actual justice system. So it doesn't, a lot of what NGOs have done all over the world is kind of incapacitate or decapacitate local people, because then they become dependent on outside expertise and outside funding. And, when, now it's really cool to work with indigenous women. Oh, but now it's really important to work over
there's
here.
no continuity.
And suddenly everything falls apart.
Right.
So people in Guatemala who were struggling to create the CICIG were very much against making them dependent.
Right.
So what they did was create this space in which this new kind of investigation could happen, but it also created a new kind of court, the Special High Impact Court. And that is the court that started in 2010 where Rios Montt was tried, where some of the only people who've been put in jail for massacres were tried in a couple of cases, and where, I don't know if you followed that on February 1st, a new case, again, first time that sexual slavery has ever been tried. The military officers responsible for sexual enslavement of indigenous women are being tried in their home country. It's never happened before, it's in this court.
So this is amazing. Because,
it is amazing
because as someone who is from Latin America, I think it gives people hope.
Yeah. And so just quickly, it was this group, CICIG, that started doing some of the investigations into people around former General Otto Perez Molina and his vice president, members of his
everybody
cabinet.
ended up in jail.
Everybody ended up in jail.
Which is it's amazing.
It's completely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been great having you.
It's been wonderful getting to know you.
Come back to Rice.
Yo sé que tú puedes, que tú eres capaz.
Cambia tu vida,
La vida es una y tú vas a triunfar.
cambia tu vida.
Con fe y esperanza, las puertas se abrirán.